And also recently, Skills International joined as the GAN New Zealand partners, one of 17 countries to join the network. We've been working closely with Josh on a number of things now, probably since, would have been October 2 years ago, Josh, when we met in Indonesia, looking at the VET system there. So thank you for your time today and welcome aboard.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Gary and Dean, and of course AEN Victoria. I am sorry not to be there in person, although this is sort of back to plan A. I think originally the invitation was for a virtual event because of the way of the world, and then we had a Trans-Tasman bubble, and then unfortunately Victoria locked down, but then by the time it came around we might have even been able to do it. But look, it's just, I think we all got to work with all of these contingencies nowadays. But look, thank you it's nice to meet you all, those of you on the call, and I hope you do find this interesting, if not useful. I think there are a number of, we're both, in both sides of the Tasman, we're in a bit of a period of reform and reshaping and reimagining around vocational education and training. And I think, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about where it's all heading, and, and several juries are still out. But I think hopefully the story I've got to tell you about what goes on over here, I think the acronyms are different, but the issues might sound a bit familiar. So look, without further ado, I'll kick on with my slides. And so, if I give you back a few minutes of your day, that's good. So again, thanks for coming along. So just running through the structure of what I'm planning to do, I'll give you, the world's shortest potted history of vocational education and training in New Zealand, specifically focusing on workplace training and apprenticeships, which is where the majority of my professional background's been, both in the industry training sector. I led the Federation of New Zealand's ITOs. That's a bit like your SSOs, but you'll find out they're a bit different, and the apprenticeship system. But also I was for a few years one of the policy managers in the New Zealand Ministry, with responsibilities for vocational education, school to work transitions, and foundation level tertiary, which is an interesting thing if you think about why you would combine those things in the first place. And we'll talk about the perceptions of VET later. As I've already mentioned, what's happening in New Zealand's vocational reforms, and I will try and point to a few interesting contrasts. Again, I disclaim I'm not an expert on the Australian system, but every time I have gone over, as I mentioned in that ministry role, I even travelled with a fella named Stephen Joyce 2 or 3 times to something called the COAG ISC and NATES and Scotties. And every time I got back on the plane to New Zealand, I felt very grateful that we had one government and just one state. So, I'm very aware, of course, that you've got the layers of state-based and federal-based policies and responsibilities and roles in terms of your VET system. So I'm lucky, I guess, with the simplicity. But again, I just do want to say that, if there's something I get wrong, it's not my fault. I do want to touch, of course, on COVID-19. Both of our countries in the end, let's not be glib about it, we've done a lot better than many other places around the world in terms of the health impacts of COVID-19. But of course, the various things in terms of borders, economic impacts, supply chains, all of those are certainly coming to light. So I'll talk about some of the responses that's happened in industry and government as a result of that. Group training in New Zealand. Of course, this is a group training association conference, and if I was there in person, I would be asking you to tell me over the coffee cups at lunchtime what your secret is. I'll get there. We do have group training in New Zealand, but I have to say that in my personal opinion, and it is a personal view, it's certainly not as organised as it is in Australia in terms of associations and the number of employers, and how organised it is as a real core part of your apprenticeship system. And I wonder why. It could just be the size factor, but it would be interesting to discuss if we get into the Q&A. I will mention GAN New Zealand, as Gary's mentioned. Thanks to Gary, we are doing that. So I'll talk a little bit about what Global Apprenticeship Network means to us in New Zealand, and I think, again, some opportunities for us to work Trans-Tasman in that regard. And then I will give you just some of my favourite rants on why, in terms of my professional history, I'm completely compelled by work-based learning as the answer to a whole lot of skills challenges, you know, COVID or not. So, all right, let's get on with the show. This is the VET system in New Zealand as it stands in terms of formal vocational education and training. By formal, I mean it's linked to a credential or qualification on our New Zealand qualifications framework, and it's, you know, supported as part of, if you like, the government's skills and training system. So vocational education and training, if you look at the orange stick there, you'll see that better than 50% of the learners in New Zealand who we class as vocational are working in our work-based training and apprenticeship system. That means they are a worker. They're generally a worker first and a student second. They have a job, they have a real employer. And in our situation, they're supported by a third-party intermediary called an ITO. So the industry training organisations, we have 11 of them covering approximately 3/4 of the industries, if you want to work it out against the occupational classifications. But it's obviously a core part of New Zealand's VET system. In fact, so we're better than half of, all, you know, more than the rest combined. And for example, there are twice as many ITO supported learners in New Zealand as there are vocational learners in our polytechnic system. That would be the equivalent of your TAFEs, and more on that later when we get to the reform. So that's kind of how that shakes out. You can see the numbers dipping there, and I've got another graph in a second that will break that down for you in a bit more detail in terms of what was going on there in 2010. But, you know, we all remember the letters GFC. That was certainly a big part of that. More broadly, though, sort of on an international comparison, we're quite proud of this. New Zealand doesn't always come first in the OECD on too many things, or not things that you want to be first in, but this is one that I do think we want to be first in, and that is the participation of our adult, you know, working age adults who said that in the last 12 months they've had some job-related training, you know, supported by their employer. So, I mean, what that says to me is that, you know, at least by international standards, our employers have a strong culture of training. And we are an economy a bit like yours, perhaps worse than yours, in terms of the predominance of SME. SME is probably even overstating it. There's nano and micro and small businesses. Half our workforce is in firms of 100 or more people, but 95% of the enterprises in New Zealand hire 5 or fewer people. But as you can see on that graph there, in terms of the key, you know, the actual black and grey is the formal stuff leading to the qualifications on the framework, as I mentioned before, and the orange stick is informal. So, of course, as I think everybody knows, but we probably don't think about often enough, of course, all employers train, they have to. All employers are involved in training. The critical choice is whether or not they are choosing to train as part of the system or not. And so, you know, we have a whole lot of people reporting that they're getting informal stuff, and that's great. The formal is also reasonably good. I think, you know, it's we've worked it out. It's about 15% of the firms in New Zealand are working with the ITOs, which rate's okay. It's about the same as the United Kingdom. It's slightly behind your gold standards of Switzerland, but as you can see, overall, on a self-reported survey, we come first in the OECD. I'll also mention at this point we're currently first in the ICC test rankings, and I might also mention that we're first in the ICC ODI rankings if you want some extra credit on New Zealand at the moment, but we'll leave that sitting there while it rains in London and we don't get to be the world champions.
Normally you can only rely on your rugby team, Josh, but we'll give you the cricket for
now. I know, it's not very often, I have to say, in the history of my life since, you know, the mid-80s and Lance Cairns hitting 6 sixes at the MCG one famous day in 1983, we haven't been able to gloat about our cricket team all that often, so you've got to give me this one.
Well, all I remember is Trevor Chappell doing what his bigger brother told him to do. Yes, yeah, we won't go there, eh?
So here we go with that slightly more broken down bit on our traineeships and apprenticeships over the last 20 years. So that's your kind of direction of travel. And funnily enough, as a proportion of the workforce, and going much further back than this graph, in 1987, about 6% of our workforce were apprentices, and in 2021, it's about 6% of our workforce are apprentices, but the workforce itself has gained about 1.2 million over that time. I think from 1.6 million to 2.8 million is our workforce. So we're not very big. But there you go. Traineeships, what you'll see there in 2010 was a big drop. And there were two factors there. One certainly was the global financial crisis. We had a recession. There were a lot of layoffs at that time. Unemployment went up. Youth unemployment went up twice as fast. And of course, things like apprentices and trainees were generally, last in, first out sort of stuff. And also, you've got that training mentality of employers which is perceiving training as a cost. And therefore, if it's a cost, I can either outsource it or I can cut it. So, training becomes the nice to have in downturns. Sort of fast forwarding to COVID, it's kind of good to see that I think the government now has sort of learnt from that. We've seen a whole lot more stimulus coming into training to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because, unless you actually manage your skills supply as a supply chain, people who are starting out, people who are halfway there, and people who are fully, ticketed, licensed professional tradespeople of the skills levels that our economies need, then you've got a problem, if you create that hole for yourself, if you just let all the trainees go. But the other thing that was going on there, and I'm very happy to admit it, was at that time in New Zealand, the ITOs numbered 40, and several of them, probably around about half, were performing pretty badly. The headline at the time was, I think, a series of audits by a funding body found 11 deceased trainees. Well, 11 deceased people out of 200,000 is sort of about 2 weeks worth of death rate, but it was still an awesome headline. What was really indefensible was that half of the trainees in 2009 didn't achieve a credit that year. So they were on the books of the ITOs and subsidies were being collected, but they weren't achieving anything. So the minister at that time was a guy by the name of Stephen Leonard Joyce. And Stephen Joyce, I know, is a name that's come up for you guys a bit lately in terms of vocational education and training, with the skills expert panel that that's being chaired and with a series of ministers, and of course the strengthening skills report that he wrote for the Scott Morrison government before your last general election, and then everybody had to pick it up again when Morrison went and won that election. And I understand that, it made 71 recommendations, all of which were accepted. But of course, there is a process in terms of roadmaps and state responses. And I know it wasn't the only review going on at the time. But anyway, so, I guess this is just maybe useful context, because that minister launched a review of the ITOs at that time following those performance audits, which was pretty careful and pretty considered. I mean, it was about an 18-month period of him effectively concluding that, well, you guys, your performance is appalling, but your system is not. There certainly were lots of the familiar complaints that the ITOs aren't very responsive, it takes too long to get qualifications up to date, they're coming out and the skills aren't right. All of those sort of normal things, which are, pretty kind of perennial with vet systems. And, the whole point is to try and make sure those lags are as short as possible, but there is always a bit of a lag. But in the end, as I say, he didn't get rid of the fundamentals of the system. He certainly made some tweaks. But the other thing that kind of happened more implicitly than explicitly was he said, well, you get to stand or fall on your performance. So what we saw at that point was a lot of mergers. The 40 ITOs turned into 11, although as the standard setting bodies, they managed to basically, we didn't lose any coverage over that period. There wasn't any attrition. We didn't lose industries from the system. It was just that those industries were being looked after by fewer, larger ITOs. It wasn't always that bigger was better. We still had a few littlies where their industries were happy and they continued on as long as they could show that they were getting the outcomes. So it wasn't just a bigger is better, but there was something about the capability of a larger organisation with that critical mass to be able to support and provide the level of service to those employers that frankly some of those employers didn't know they could get because they'd been used to working with their small ITO. Fast forwarding again, so just looking at the trajectory now, there were, again, at the end of the Joyce review, some policy changes around, a better level of support for apprenticeships, probably at least against traineeships. So what we've probably seen, and particularly lately, given I think the COVID stuff has affected the sectors that tended to go for traineeships. I mean, in New Zealand, literally the difference is an apprenticeship is you end up with a level 4 qualification of 120 credits or greater. And if it's smaller than that, it's a traineeship. Apprenticeships attract a slightly higher level of subsidy, and apprenticeships has been where there's been a lot of the kind of stimulus and push policies to get more employers into the system. That probably brings me to, what we've done for COVID, which I've got a slide for, but just I'll give you the figure now. In 2020, the year of COVID, apprenticeships went up 17%, so that was pretty significant. When I left the ITF in 2019, we'd just at that stage been putting out press releases about having 50,000 apprentices, which basically had taken the 10 years since the GFC to get back to 50,000, and now it's at 60,000. So it's quite rapid growth. I think it shows the thing. I mean, I know that both in Australia and New Zealand, when COVID hit, there were all kinds of projections about where unemployment would go, and our economies have done vastly better than that. And, those really ghastly unemployment predictions haven't come to pass, and touch wood, they don't. But I think, the difference between a virus-led recession is that as soon as you can get out and move around safely, the work is all still there and the skill shortages are all still there. That's quite different from a GFC where, people can't get credit. It's, it's a much more of a financial-led recession than a virus-led one. So I think that's pretty different. Just going to quickly flick through a couple of more interesting trends. So gender, it's going up, but still grim is the short story. And, there is a bit of a focus on it. So in New Zealand, at the moment, 14% of all our apprentices are female. And that's been up about a percent a year for the last 4 years or so, which, is enough to tell us that there's a trend there. And it was languishing about 9 or 10 sort of since forever, but now sort of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And new starts are at 18% female. So, the new ones are higher than the overall. So that definitely suggests the trajectory is in the right direction. But you peel that back one layer, and what you find is that, of course, things like social care, aged residential care, community services, and things like hair and beauty, that's where the numbers are. And that actually, when you peel down into the things like the, skilled, if you like, your traditional trades, which are thoroughly male dominated, it's still at that 2 or 3%. In our own case, around things like electrical and plumbing, we're pretty proud of the fact we're hitting about 4. So it's up, but it's still, a long way to go. But at least there does seem to be a positive trajectory. This one I'll do really quick because, on first glance, I get that's a complicated couple of graphs, but the short story is this. Over the last decade, the prior attainment of our new trainees and apprentices has increased appreciably. What do I mean? Well, in the year 2017, in fact, I believe that people with completed degrees were the single largest group of traineeships. And that was higher by a percentage point than people with further qualifications, certs and diplomas. In 2010, 15% of the new trainees had a degree, and in 2020 that was up to 29%. So, from 1 in 6 to getting up to 1 in 3, which is pretty extraordinary over a decade. It says something about what the labour market is demanding. It also, I think, says something about careers advice to young people and school leavers and the importance of being clear about the fact that earn and learn is out there, and that while it's perfectly okay for them to go and get a degree and then join the workforce, actually you can avoid that student loan potentially. And as I say, I just think it's also interesting about, if we think about young people and their hopes and expectations for the future. Again, I'm not making a value judgment there. I actually hate university versus trades graphs, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute too. But I think it's certainly worth noticing, you know, a statistically significant thing that says there's quite a lot of qualification inflation going on here. And I think what it really tells us is we need, as systems, to focus on education to employment, not university versus the workforce. You know, everybody is making that journey into the workforce if we think about our young people. And so what we tell them, you know, really matters. And for the ones that are going to uni, just as much as the ones who aren't going to uni, what they understand about the world of work and things like employability and core skills become, I think, really important. But, you know, just, I think it's definitely worth pondering what's going on there, given that amount of increased prior attainment for our new people into the training and apprenticeship system. So look, ITOs in New Zealand, and that's years 1992 to 2022, because in fact the ITO regime is coming to an end as a result of New Zealand's reform of vocational education. Yeah, so 30 years, as I've already talked about the Joyce review that happened in 2010, and in about the year 2000, there was another reasonable reform under the modern apprenticeships program at that time. But what this is effectively doing, you know, ITOs really, when you boil it down, had two roles. They had that standard setting body function. So like your old ISCs or your SSOs, you know, there's the role to set the occupational standards, working with reference groups from industries, doing the bits of paper, getting things registered on the framework. But the other thing that the ITOs did that was different from the sector skills councils of UK or Canada or the industry skills councils of Australia was that those same organisations also made the arrangements for training. So they were in receipt of subsidies. They worked with the employers in that industry to get training agreements in place, and then provide support to the employer and the apprentice to achieve the qualifications. The industry training organisation wasn't itself allowed to train. That was always a tricky conversation with a new employer because the T in ITO stands for training, but they didn't train. So some people found it too complicated already and said, see you later. But in the end, what that did, I think, was create quite a unique couple of things. One was purchasing power over provision. So the subsidies that the ITOs would get for the sign-ups, you know, in terms of things like it would support, you know, assessment and moderation and the training support on site, but it could also be used to purchase the block courses or the off-job components of programs as well. And when you think about it, you know, I think that sort of demand-led purchase was particularly important because employers, you know, have not got too many incentives to have people learning stuff they don't need to learn, or repeating stuff that they already know, or investing in courses and providers that they know to be delivering a poor level of provision. So in a sense, by letting the demand side do the buying, you know, industry doesn't necessarily have that many incentives to rort itself when it comes to upskilling the workforce for an industry. So I think that was kind of important. The second one was of the business. Sorry, my sound, is my sound all right? Yeah, I'm thinking, oh, I might just pull these out and see what happens.
Dropped out for a second there, Josh, but I think it's okay.
How about now?
Yep.
Apologies for that, everyone. Sorry, it was the old AirPods that they ran out of gas there. Yes, so look, second reason, so your demand side purchasing was important. Second reason was when the car came up the driveway of the workplace, even if it was the smallest employer, you know, someone running a single apprentice as a sort of, you know, a two-person band, if you like, they're talking to the standard setting body. Now, I'm not saying it was always perfect in terms of the internal comms and ITOs, but in the end, it meant each and every employer had a voice and a feedback loop into the standard setter. So when, you know, things were getting out of date or things were emerging or things needed to be updated, we were getting that information because of that dual role to both arrange and set the standards. So we've seen that as pretty powerful over the years. I won't go on too long about this, but I mean, this is kind of us now, if you like, because the ITO role. So formally, we are currently a transitional ITO. We're developing a transition plan, and I'll let you know in a moment what the new entities are, where things are going. But in the meanwhile, as an organisation, Skills, which was the largest of the ITOs, certainly in terms of industry coverage, we have 24,000 learners, I think about 5,000 apprentices, 19,000 trainees across 23 sectors. But we also, probably a bit because of our size, have been getting involved in a lot of other things, careers, outplacement, EAP, and consultancy, which is sort of why we've now formed up as a group then. And we intend as an organisation to go on even beyond having transitioned our formal ITO roles through that reform. So that's kind of us. Yeah, so look, I mean, our industry coverage, I mean, Skills began life as one of the larger and better performing ITOs in the form of ET-ITO, that was the electrotechnology ITO. Then post the Joyce reform, we picked up plumbing, gas fitting, drain laying, roofing, scaffolding, a number of specialist trades. But then we were also a bit of a catch-all for some of the, I don't know, what's the best way to say it, people that found themselves a bit orphaned. So, everything from emergency management to the public sector. So, we've got quite a number of different things in there, and we do run different models according to the preferences of those industries, which is another, I think, important component of when you've got the a demand side industry-owned organisation that's making those arrangements. So I guess, I mean, if I look at Australia, you have your ASINs, and of course the group training employers do a lot of this stuff too, but the actual on-site support for the apprentice plus the standard setting function, those things are together, and that's of course worth reflecting on, given Mr. Joyce in his report to your country talked about skills organisations, and I understand that there are 3 pilots and that these are end-to-end organisations and that they are industry owned. And then of course I see 2 weeks ago in your federal budget quite a sum of money to establish up to 15 skills enterprises, which again, I think, let me find the words, described as industry owned, end-to-end, a strong strategic industry voice, drove collaboration across sectors, addressed workforce challenges, developed qualifications to meet evolving industry needs. I mean, I would have claimed that bullet point list for New Zealand's industry training organisations, but that is not their description. That's the description of the skills enterprises that have been announced to be established in Australia. So quite clearly, I think there is a resemblance there, and that makes sense, I think, in terms of, I know Minister Joyce is a very clever, very thoughtful and diligent person, but, I think he has brought a little bit of what he's known from his New Zealand experience into what he is suggesting for Australia. So what's happening here? We've got a reform. It was announced in 2019. Our polytechnics, of which there are 16 nationally, were in some serious financial difficulty. Most of them were running deficits, and certainly the sector as a whole was in deficit. There was also a bit of a desk-based review going on at that time about kind of the broader vocational system that the Labor government, when it came in 2017, had set about doing. Now, effectively, those things got put together in terms of the reform of vocational education. So cutting to the chase, there was a short consultation and then an announcement that it was going to go ahead. Probably the win was that rather than having it all start on the 1st of January 2020, there was this 2-year transition period. So that's what we were in at the moment. So 2 things have happened, and I'll take them in reverse order here. Te PÜKENGA on the 1st of April 2020, all of our 16 polytechnics became subsidiaries of a national institution called New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, which goes by the te reo Māori name of Te PÜKENGA. And it was also announced that we would be establishing 6 workforce development councils to undertake the standard setting functions. Now, these are Crown bodies, but they are industry governed under a regulation, and they will have attached to themselves stakeholder industry groups. That sounds a little bit like the IRC SSO type arrangement. They do cover the whole economy where the ITOs didn't, so that's one difference. And the other thing that certainly is the promise on the tin is that what it says goes. Again, this is a long, boring history, but when the ITOs set their unit standards, it really became a bit of a choice for providers as to whether they had to use them or not. And so I think with this reform of vocational education, one of the minister's visions, Minister Hipkins, is we've got more consistent provision across the sector. So whether you did it off job in a polytech or on job or through a program blend or through online, that, you know, we're all consistently working to those standards that are set by those workforce development councils. There are a number of other entities created through our reform, centres of vocational excellence, regional skills leadership groups. There is a review of our resourcing system that is to roll in from 2023, and actually still, as I speak to you today, there are some concepts and principles about how that might work in terms of setting subsidies for off-job and online and in-work training and assessment. But not a lot of detail, not a lot of rates. So at the moment, there's a whole lot of structural changes going on. A lot of people argued, you know, if you fix the funding system, actually, you'll get the behaviours you're looking for. You might not need to do the structural change. But now the structural change is, at least, I guess, happening in the purity of not knowing what the funding system's going to look like, which, you know, funding does tend to drive behaviour. 6 workforce development councils, just one point about that. They are largely based off a system of vocational pathways, which actually the Industry Training Federation came up with and developed in partnership with New Zealand's Ministry of Education. This again gets a little bit of airtime in your Joyce review. The notion that the schools and the employers work together around a common framework to develop programs, and particularly interface programs where kids are able to go out and have some workplace experience or even tertiary provider experience, you know, maybe 3 days a week at school, 2 days a week in a workplace, or, you know, a kind of arrangement where they're gaining some of the skills and credits as part of, you know, if you like, a dual program. What we did over here was develop 6 vocational pathways to put some coherence around that. It helps the employers by saying, you know, if a young person's got a whole lot of orange credits, it means that they've done stuff that's recommended for construction and infrastructure and some stuff that's related to construction and infrastructure. It helps employers to recognise when a young person's got strengths, interests, talents in that area. It helps young people who want to go in that direction to choose the right subjects that are filled with the things that are going to give them orange credits. And it helps teachers who themselves may not necessarily understand the real world application of the skills of, if you like, your traditional curriculum subjects, to put together things that are coherent, even across academic disciplines. And that particularly becomes important when you are doing something like, well, we're going to do these subjects in school and we're going to do these subjects through a workplace or through a tertiary provider, and it's all going to make sense with respect to a pathway. So, you know, this is something I kind of like, is that potentially what we're going to have is a system where the schools talk about this framework of 6 colour-coded sector-based pathways, but then so does the VET system. So when I'm moving through different parts of the system, I can see what the choices are with respect to those sectors. To PÜKENGA, I think I've discussed. So yeah, we've integrated all 16 of our institutes of technology and polytechnics, and again, by way of swapping notes, I do believe that a couple or more states of Australia in the last 5 or 6 years have kind of been going down the same way, where individual TAFEs have merged up or come together or completely merged or stayed autonomously branded but have an umbrella organisation. So keen to hear more. Again, so what's happening there is the ITO role around the management and arrangement and support of work-based training and apprenticeships is going to the provider layer. So hence, the ITOs are disbanded. The Act was repealed, and there is no ITO regime. And as you're going right back to that first graph, you know, that's over 50% of the learners. So that's a reasonably big deal. And there's quite a lot of work, hard work at the moment going on to make sure that the transition actually makes sure that we are keeping the employers in the system, because they can always choose not to be in the system, and that things are as seamless as possible across the transition. And so that's the vision of it. The goal is a national public network of provider-based, work-based and online provision. Brings me to COVID. I will just keep rattling on. Is this all right? I mean, we could stop and keep. Okay, I'll just keep going. Where are we? 3:38. I promise there'll be at least 10 to 15 minutes of chat. I'll do the GAN part really quick. COVID-19, certainly, we saw in Budget 2020 an enormous amount of money. The GDP to national debt ratio is out the window, and a lot of big contingency spending, and a lot of it actually was specifically aimed at making sure that skills and training continued to happen. A universal wage subsidy that ran after the first wave of the COVID thing turned into a wage subsidy for the employers of first and second year apprentices. Now, I haven't actually done the math. I'm pretty sure this is less generous than your 50% wage subsidy that you've got in Australia. But employers of apprentices in New Zealand get $1,000 a month for a first year and $500 a month for a second year. That has worked. It certainly has gotten more employers into the system. I would also just add to that, it's got a lot of people who were already working in industries are suddenly apprentices. But, there's nothing wrong with that if they are getting the outcomes and the credentialised outcomes. And if we're supporting training, then that's always a good thing. We would have argued for 15 years or more that actually offsetting the costs of employers of training for a formal qualification is absolutely the right thing to do, given the time and in-kind and capital contribution that employers are making when the workplace is the campus and when the employer is the teacher. Certainly those learners are worth a lot more than that if they don't have a job and they enrol in a polytechnic and are trained on something that we then kind of hope they get an employment outcome out of, and then we hope that the skills were up to date and right and that we don't have to do it all over again. So, as far as that goes, if you think about the vet as a system, and if somebody's in a job, they are, the labour market outcome, the labour market matching's already happened, and they're learning the right stuff on the right stuff because they're in the real economy, and they're contributing, even if they're not the most productive worker in the world, then, I've never seen a reason why we wouldn't offset the costs to employers like we offset the costs to institutions. So, Apprenticeship Boost was the big ticket. That was the $1,000 a month thing. Trades Training and Apprenticeship Fund, that's made basically all vet courses in priority areas, but it's just about all of them free, and all apprenticeships in all areas are free. So fees are being met by the government through to the end of next year. There was just relevant to you in terms of group training was there was a one shot, as it turned out, 1 year's worth of money, $16 million to support our current group training employers to keep people on. So of course, less work out there off the back of the forecasts around unemployment, which didn't come to pass as badly as people thought, and I think that may be the reason why it's now stopped. But there was basically a stopgap funding to make sure that the group training employers didn't fall over. 2021, we've seen a little bit of movement in the rates. They've restored an old policy called Training Incentive Allowance, which allows people who are on job seeker benefits to top up their benefit if they undertake some study. And that's been extended, it used to be just for degree level stuff. So that's been extended all the way down to cover the vocational part of the system as well. So it's good. And as I mentioned, the group training stuff has been finished. Question time. So group training in New Zealand. First thing I want to say is these organisations are well known and highly regarded. Particularly in terms of regulated and licensed trades, and some of these organisations are our members, given that Skills looks after things like electrical and plumbing. So EDCO, Masterlink, they are I guess, the kind of poster children for group training here in New Zealand. And so I think the model is as the model is for you guys. You know, there is the holding employer, and they are rotated around employers. And I think even before there was a pandemic, when I first got to know Gary Workman, I said, you know, it just seems like a no-brainer. I can't understand why it isn't bigger and applying in more areas in New Zealand. But I think that's particularly the case in downturns. I mean, you talk about de-risking the individual recruitment decision to an employer anyway, you know, so I mean, the extent to which it can be a bit of an insurance policy against a nightmare recruitment decision for an individual employer. But more to the point, if I'm looking at it from the learner's shoes, you know, that rotation around a number of different workplaces and employers and styles and cultures allows them to find their fit, but also to see a broader range of the industry in action, and potentially, of course, to get a broader range of skills, given that different enterprises are up to different stuff. So, I mean, and to me, you know, it's always seemed like an underdone or an underutilised asset in the New Zealand system, notwithstanding that we do have these organisations and trusts, which, as I say, are really well regarded. But, you know, critical mass-wise, we don't have associations. There's no kind of national body. There's not a peak body for group training. And I think, you know, I know you guys talk about direct employed and group training. You know, we would see direct employed and group training. And I wonder why. GAN. So yeah, a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, in Indonesia, although in fact I had already heard of Global Apprenticeship Network, but I got talking in a German beer bar with this guy called Gary Workman, who talked about GAN Australia and what that was doing. And so, you know, we were pretty terribly inspired and decided to steal all his ideas, and he was very good at sharing the MOU. So I mean, as I think most of you will know, Global Apprenticeship Network is an international network. It's headquartered in Switzerland, and its founders are the big European agencies like the OECD and the International Labour Organization and the Institute of Employers Federations. But it's governed by a private sector board of, you know, a lot of the major multinationals. And so, I mean, you know, there's a number of reasons why kind of domestically and internationally we wanted to get involved as an international consultancy in the first place. But I mean, being connected up with that evidence and the connection to trends. I've just talked about the changes that are going on in New Zealand, particularly the roles around work-based learning and apprenticeships. You know, rights or wrongs of it aside, and quite agnostic of who does what, there is such a thing as doing workplace training well, and we've got quite a lot of evidence about that. So whether it's formal or informal, or private sector driven or public sector driven, or whether you used to be an ITO and now you work for PÜKENGA or whatever, if you want to know about apprenticeships, we're keen to position GAN as that kind of clearinghouse for, you know, a bit of a neutral advocate for the model, because that's what we like. There is that kind of pan-sector advocacy, and there is also, I don't want to underplay this, I think the celebration and acknowledgement of committed employers, you know, people that train as part of something bigger than their own business, or train workers not just for the job that they've got, but for the career that they're going to have. I think all of that deserves as much kind of praise as we can give it. We've picked up some focus areas, and I doubt you'll be shocked by any of them. I've talked about the gender stats in New Zealand, so we've picked up on that straight away. We want to build up some research and promotional efforts to attract more young women into trades, and we're doing quite a bit of work, and we have quite a lot of evidence around what the barriers are, both from the young women, their point of view, and what they're being told and what they are and are being told that they can aspire to, and of course some of the awkward stuff on the employer side. It's not you know, it's not all awkward, but you know, we're talking about sort of quite steeped cultures and workplaces and stuff where, you know, there are some, I think, you know, things are heading in the right direction, but you know, it takes a while for leopards to change spots, and you know, the arguments around filling, you know, making sure you're actually getting the skills you need, and fishing in half the pond, and all of those things I think are really important. Equity and achievement, you know, we do have ethnic disparities, but actually this is a sort of a positive story. workplace training and apprenticeships, you can take any part of the education system in New Zealand from early childhood to university and in between. The place where you see least gap between Māori and non-Māori is in workplace training and apprenticeships. To me, that makes complete sense because what they're learning is completely bound up with what they're doing for a job. So it's, you know, it's practical, it's applicable, the theory and the practice, all of those pedagogical reasons why workplace training is a great model. So we want to build on that success. Employers are really important, and I think, you know, one of the things that I do kind of observe with the reform stuff, I mean, we talk a lot about learner-centred, and absolutely I agree that we should have a learner-centred system, and the system should get around a learner and support them. But if it's vocational education, then ultimately the judge of whether it's good or not is somebody called an employer, because they give out the jobs and they value the learning or they don't. And, you know, in the end, if an employer ultimately doesn't value the vocational education, however and wherever it's happened, then it wasn't very vocational and the learner doesn't win. So getting that together, so, you know, learner-centred but employer-focused, and particularly, as I think, you know, a lot of you will know, in the apprenticeship space, oftentimes that training advisor is supporting the employer just as much as they are the apprentice. And I think that's something that's not necessarily that well understood. So, you know, that's, again, an area we want to progress in terms of support for employers for how to do on-job training well. And this finally is one where New Zealand, I think, is about a decade behind. There is very, very, very little going on or thinking going on as far as I can tell. There's a couple of researchy efforts, but certainly nothing systemic, or, you know, even pilots seem to have disappeared around higher level apprenticeships. So just on the principle that, you know, you don't have to wear high vis to be an apprentice, you can also wear a white coat or a shirt and tie. That, you know, learning on the job under the wing of an employer is a model for a much wider range of industries, which certainly, you know, we're seeing lots of, you know, UK and the Europe are well down this track in terms of graduate apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships, and, you know, strongly on-job pathways to achieving higher level credentials. And so that's something that we're keen to chase up, make sure something gets going here because it is happening offshore. And, you know, finally, just an ad. So we welcome Australians. You can be an honorary Kiwi, and you can, along with signing up for Gary's stuff. And, you know, I have to say, you know, not only were we sort of inspired by Gary, we're going to steal a whole bunch more of his ideas. I think what he's doing around, you know, your dashboards around apprenticeship starts and finishes, vacancies, you know, we haven't got that. The data is very old, it's very dense, and it's buried on a government website somewhere. So, you know, we think we can do a job of, you know, just getting people to come and see GAN New Zealand because that's the easiest place to find out, you know, some of that really basic information. And I think it's also worth mentioning here that, you know, prior to COVID, Gary and I were also talking about if we get GAN Australia and New Zealand, then there's a whole lot of trans-Tasman things that we can be doing, looking at the Indo-Pacific region in particular in terms of outreach and best practice and some of that kind of wider work. 9 minutes for questions, so I'll just leave this hanging. I want to make one kind of point, though, and it's right there at the end. I mean, so this is all of the win-win-win-win-win reasons why I think before COVID and after, if we were talking about the future of work and ageing workforces and technology change, lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling, that's a reality. COVID's accelerated that. So for me, you know, starting with the employer for our vocational education systems is the right place to start. I noticed, though, that, you know, education systems, in my experience, tend to lurch to the latest thing. And what we all noticed in 2020 was that, you know, lots of people were lucky enough to do their jobs on Zoom, like I can do my job on Zoom or Teams. But look at who turned out to be essential and look at how the tradies for residential construction in particular are booked up for years, and look at apprenticeships being up 17%. And notice that if we kind of lurch the schools to go, let's teach everybody to work from home and use Zoom very well, what we'd be neglecting in terms of the essential and practical skills, the things that cannot be done on a video call, the making things, building things, fixing things. That's why I think skilled trades actually still offer the prospect of a more secure future, a less automatable future, and certainly a resilient one. Thanks very much. That is me. I hope that's been, well, thank you for the opportunity to make my favourite speech.
Thanks, Josh. I have turned on everyone's microphone so they can turn them on to ask some specific questions if they want. They're automatically on mute, but if you click on it, it will turn on. I had one quick question for you. I think you've covered quite a broad range of topics there, and for us to go through all that, we could easily spend another few hours. But the skills organisation, so we're certainly keen from, New Zealand have had them in place for 10 to 15 years. They seem to be doing everything from the curriculum development, the career advice, developing training resources, engaging with employers. That, in theory, a one-stop shop looks good on the surface from our end, and certainly that's where the government seem to be wanting to push the Australian system. From having lived this for the last 10 to 15 years, what worked well from your perspective, and what necessarily don't you think could be applied in an Australian context where we're such a large geographical area, and how do we actually tap into this in Australia?
Yeah, I think that what was good was the demand-led bottom-up nature of it. So, the ITOs ended up, as best as they could, reflecting the industry's preferences in terms of how training would happen, and as say the incentives around purchasing the right kind of off-job and supporting the on-job, and the feedback loop. So, that real world information from the small, large, every employer coming into, the person that you're talking to is from the standard setter. I think that was the good. The not so good, I think, probably did apply around the lack of choice. So, the ITOs were industry owned but government mandated, and so they were recognised for a period of years. That meant that if you were an employer in that industry, you had to work with your ITO. There were some employer choice provisions, but they were never used. So, it was, I suppose the dark side of a one-stop shop is there's only one shop. So you had to kind of work with your ITO. And so certainly one of the arguments that's been made about the reform is that in 2025, when an employer wants to run an apprentice, they'll have a number of phone numbers they can ring. They'll all be working to the standards set by a Workforce Development Council, but they could work with our Indigenous organisations, or they could work with a private training establishment, or they could work with the new Te PÜKENGA National Polytech. So that there's supposed to be some more choices there from the employer perspective. So I suppose that's probably one thing that I'd point to around, potentially a flaw if you've got that one skills organisation, at least in the way that we set it up. Yeah.
And considering the 4 GTOs that you have in New Zealand, how did they interact with the SOs?
Well, yeah, so they were a bit like a class of provider, if you like. So they tended to work with the ITOs in terms of using the units of competency, the standards and the qualifications. And I have to say, unlike some of the providers who would kind of create their own stuff or create their own credentials or their own programs and sort of get around the industry standards, no, the GTOs certainly have been pretty steadfast in the use of the New Zealand quals, because it's workplace-based training, it's apprenticeships. So that's kind of how they've worked. As I mentioned, a couple of those names, and that might not be comprehensive, by the way. So I beg forgiveness from any New Zealand group training employers that I've forgotten. But a couple of those are our members as stakeholders of the skills organisation. So there is a bit of a two-way loop there.
Yep. Was the distance an issue for supplying small markets in New Zealand?
We had to be national in reach. You wouldn't be recognised if you weren't. So a lot of the larger ITOs, and this might go to that fewer larger thing. You've got an industry like marine, for instance, which is pretty much, there's a couple of satellites, but most of it's in Auckland. So that would kind of work for that. Likes of us, though, you've certainly got case manager, account manager models where people are in sign written cars and sometimes driving some distances to get places. we're not as big as you. You know, you got driveways as long as islands. So, so yeah, there was that. The other thing to note, though, is I think, you know, that account management model was only one way to do it. You know, workplace assessors, where the supervisor in the aged residential home care, as one of his or her responsibilities, is doing assessment, which is then verified. So, you know, there was a verifier model that played out. So it wasn't just kind of the person coming along to visit with the employer and the apprentice.
I know I'm hogging the questions, but I do have one last one, and it was over the 10 to 15 years that this was in place. Did you see that innovation was more stifled or more accepted in this model? If industry's leading it, did you see them trying to push themselves to new directions?
Yeah, for sure. And I think different ITOs kind of approach this differently. And again, I think that was a function of being bottom up and being, you know, I actually think it was a proof point that they were industry led. I mean, when I led the Federation, there were 11 very different logos, and they were they highly diverse in terms of kind of size and focus and priorities. But to me, that was always a bit of a strength. It meant that they were actually, you know, kind of responding to the needs of their industries. But absolutely, and for some period of time, this was a formal role that was called skills leadership, and that was the things like labour market analysis, the what's coming, and there was both a government-facing part to that role and an industry-facing part to that role. You know, we're all busy, but we have this thing over here that thinks about the skills and training needs kind of for the future. Some of them were into putting out strategies and policy papers, for sure. Others, and skills would be an example of this, they, you know, we ended up acquiring about 7 companies to do different things, all in the kind of field of people capability and you know, workforce development.
Yeah, I know Dean's got his hand up. Throw your mic on, Dean.
Josh, question around the size of the market. And I'm not quite sure how the transition back to the polytechnics being the major provider of training has actually gone, and it might be too early to actually answer that question.
Yeah.
But in terms of the size of the New Zealand market, is it too small for sort of, you know, ISOs and polytechnics to coexist? Or do you think that there could possibly be a hybrid model where you can do both?
Yeah. I think you have to have a hybrid model that does both. I mean, I think that, you know, in any community, the idea that there's a place where you go and do the bit that you can't do in the workplace, you know, makes total sense. And of course, digital learning in some ways has meant a lot more of that kind of learning can, you know, be in your hand when you're on the work site. But look, I think, you know, in terms of the size of it, there were 60,000 vocational students in our polytechnics, but their total number was 110,000 because they were also doing quite a bit at degree level and also a bit of a slice of the real foundation level stuff, literacy, numeracy, second chance, hard to reach stuff. So the vocational bit in the middle, I mean, so there's a bit of this story which is about, I think, the reformers asking the polytechnic to get back to its technical and vocational roots. And, you know, so... Yeah, look, in the end, I think they talk about 240,000 learners. So, I mean, but, you know, so into the first part of your question, at the moment, Te Pūkenga hasn't got any of the ITO learners. I think the first transition is due to happen this August with a couple of early moving ITOs that are basically becoming also a subsidiary of Te Pūkenga to continue to carry out some of the workplace and apprenticeship stuff. But look, I think over time, that is the notion, is that there is this kind of integrated network where there's different options around the mode of provision, but we're all us. It's not an us and them. Because I can certainly appreciate that we did end up, at least between the polytechs and the ITOs, with somewhat parallel systems, and we were doing very well in our slice. And as I say, I think the polytechnics were struggling a bit more. And I guess the only final thing that I'd add to that is I think, the structural change doesn't necessarily change the external future of work type factors, which were some of the reasons why that model was challenged. But absolutely, I think it has its place. And I think, I think the hybrid is the answer in the end. You do need a bit of it all. I mean, you get some of the old timies who even, and it's 30 years of ITOs since 1992, who say, oh, I remember they gave me a job and then they sent me off to a polytechnic for 18 weeks and I did the theory and then I came back, and that was hard yakka, but it was wonderful. And I think the difference there was, of course, the employer had already made the commitment to that person and given them the job. And they tend to remember that person's name too, right? So look, don't get me wrong. I've never been anti-polytechnics. I've tried, and particularly with my ministry background, I've had to walk, had a shoe on each foot. So I think there's a lot to be applauded in the way that it's been, in bringing it together. I think, sometimes the sort of structural nature of it, or the kind of magnitude of the change, we better tread carefully, I think.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Dean. The MC's on a call.
Sorry, Josh. We've got a board meeting that started 3 minutes ago, so I'm very mindful of the time. Our chair and myself are holding everyone up. So look, we really appreciate your support. We certainly look forward to working with you over the coming months and years to develop some of these ideas further, and certainly around your insights onto the skills organisations and where you're moving from. Certainly, I think we can draw some parallels to where Australia's going at the moment. So we really appreciate your support. We'll share your presentations with everyone, and also your contact details. People may email and
yeah, great.